Welcome to Fasken's 14th consecutive mining series. My name is Virginia Schweitzer, and I'm part of the Fasken Global Mining Group. And I'm also co-managing partner of Fasken's Ottawa office. Today's webinar, a challenge for the nascent nuclear energy renaissance, harnessing the dynamics at play in the uranium mining and fuel supply and enrichment sector, is the 9th in our series of 14 seminars this year. A calendar of all of Fasken's PDAC events can be found underneath the video window for our online audience. For our online audience, please refer to the slide on your screen for some housekeeping items. Before we begin, I would like to provide a land acknowledgement. At Fasken, we have embarked on a journey of reconciliation, guided by our Reconciliation Action Plan. As part of this journey, we believe it is important to acknowledge the land and the people that have called this land home since time immemorial. Today in Toronto, where the PDAC conference is being held, we are gathered on territory that has been the home of many nations, including the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Chippewa, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Chippewa. We appreciate living and working here and recognize the importance of working to advance reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here and across Canada. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, Dyna Zekaoui, the moderator for today's session, who will introduce today's panel.
Thank you, Virginia. Good morning to everyone. My name is Dyna Zekaoui, and I am a senior associate at Fasken. And along with my colleague Ian Palm, who actually will be the moderator and introducing the panelists, and our colleague Janet Howard, we are the regional leaders of Ontario for Fasken's Global Energy and Climate Group. I'm also part of the Global Mining Group and Fasken's ESG team. And I have the wonderful pleasure of welcoming you here today for what we expect to be a fascinating discussion about the potential of nuclear energy and the surrounding dynamics at play. Now, before we begin, given the early morning start, I thought about sharing a joke about nuclear energy to lighten things up a bit, but I didn't know if the audience would react. So I decided to instead play it safe. But for those of you who may not be as connected with the sector, you might be wondering, why are we talking about nuclear energy now? Why is this suddenly of interest for everyone? One answer to this is climate change. So since the Paris Agreement signing, which was the goal to achieve net zero by 2050, global efforts have been underway to decarbonize the existing electricity grid. Now we know that part of that solution is renewable energy like solar and wind, or other initiatives like carbon capture and storage. But these alone will not be enough to achieve net zero by 2050. This is where nuclear energy comes into the picture. Not only is nuclear energy clean energy, but as recognized by the World Nuclear Association, it has a superior safety record, can be easily stockpiled in order to secure several years of supply, and offers grid stability regardless of what's happening in the climate. Many jurisdictions around the world are now looking to nuclear energy as a source of important, clean baseload electricity. This includes both our federal, Canadian, and our provincial Ontario governments. So thank you to Justin and Doug. We at Fasken have always been involved in this sector and are following these developments closely. This is why we wanted to have this timely discussion today with key experts in this sector. For those of you who are not aware, we have recently published a number of bulletins on this topic and plan to continue these bulletin series. So if you do want a copy of these bulletins or want to subscribe to our Global Energy and Climate Group mailing list, do come see me after. But for now, without further ado, I will hand it over to my colleague Ian Palm, who will be facilitating our discussion and welcoming our wonderful panelists. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thanks very much, Dyna. You hear me okay? Thanks, Dina. That's great. And we are enthusiastic about this, even bright and early in the morning. So we've got 6 panelists who are going to participate in this interesting discussion. I will briefly introduce them. I think for those online, you can see their bios in detail. And I'll start from my far left here. Brenda McDonald is the Senior Vice President, Growth, Commercial, and Supply Chain with Ontario Power Generation. She has been with OPG since 2013 when she joined as the Vice President, Law and General Counsel. She's got many years' experience both at OPG and at other organizations, including Bell. She's got an undergrad degree from St. FX and a law degree from Queen's. Welcome, Brenda. Thanks for joining us. To my immediate left and to her right is Katie LaChapelle. Katie is director with Canaccord Genuity in their metals and mining research team, and she is particularly focused on specialty minerals and metals, including battery metals and uranium. She's been with Canaccord since 2018. She's a chartered professional accountant and has a Bachelor of Commerce degree from McGill, my alma mater. So welcome. Thanks, Katie. To my immediate right, Alex Mashenko. Alex, welcome. Alex is joining us from the U.S. Alex is an independent nuclear energy consultant. He's got over 18 years in unique experience in the nuclear market analysis, transportation, logistics, and other areas of expertise. He brings an interesting collection of skills and experiences, which I think are really, which we'll get into in more detail. He holds a bachelor's degree of science, degrees in international economics and history, and an MBA in aerospace and defense from the University of Tennessee. And he's also very actively involved in various international nuclear organizations. To his right and my far right is Sean Quinn. Sean, I think Sean, you have you're the longest serving member on the panelists here in the nuclear space. So you can be you can draw back on the history of the space, which is interesting. Sean is the Senior Vice President, Chief Legal Officer, and Corporate Secretary with Cameco, and anyone involved in the nuclear sector or the mining sector will be very familiar with Cameco, both domestically and internationally. Sean's been with Cameco since 2014, and he's been the VP and General Counsel since 2004, and draws upon both domestic and international experience in the space. And Sean and I have had occasion to work on opposite sides of transactions over probably 2 or 3 decades. So welcome, Sean. Thanks for doing this morning. I appreciate that. And online, you can see we've got two additional panelists on the screen that I'm looking at. On the right-hand side, James Skonyak. James is the Senior VP and Executive VP, and Chief Development Officer with Bruce Power. He has over 20 years service with Bruce Power. Many of you know Bruce Power as the other leading nuclear operator in Ontario, in addition to OPG. James is in a particularly interesting role at the present time as Chief Development Officer, looking at the potential expansion of Bruce Power in the coming years. He's got an executive MBA from Ivy School, and he's also got a degree from the University of Guelph as well, and other certificates as well. I won't get into detail on that one. And our final panelist, Paul Murphy, is online as well. Paul is based in the U.S. He's the Managing Director, Nuclear Co-Head of Public Finance and Government Relations with Cross River Infrastructure Partners. He also has a role as Senior Advisor, Power and Utilities for KPMG, and is currently involved with them in supporting Sask Power's investigation of potential nuclear project. Paul's got decades of experience in the nuclear space, both in the US, Canada, and internationally. So we've got a really interesting collection of panelists here today. We've had some good discussions online over the past little while. I've got some questions here that I'm gonna pose to the panelists, but we've got some time as well during this discussion to get some engagement with various people. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, or if you've got a question online, type it in. We'll try and get to it. I'm going to start with Katie, just to level set things from the standpoint of capital markets. We've seen some significant changes. So last year, uranium was one of the best performing commodities. With a spot price ending the year at a 15-year high of $91 US per pound after starting the year at 48. Can you give us a sense of what drove that dramatic move in price, and where do you see we sit the demand supply curve at this stage?
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and thank you to everyone in the Fasken team for having me. Last year was, I would say, a transformative year for the industry, and I actually think it has been a couple of years in the making, at least in the last 5 years or so, that I've been predominantly focused on the uranium equities. And what's driven the recent price rise, in my opinion, is really the strong fundamental supply-demand backdrop. If I look at the demand side of the equation first, it's incredibly robust. I would argue that the outlook for nuclear power is the best it's been in decades, potentially the best ever. And what that has been driven by is public government policy, public perception changing with respect to nuclear power, and that has materialized in a number of new build announcements, whether that's conventional nuclear reactors or plans for microreactors and SMRs, but also extensions of existing reactors, the life extensions of in the US, government funding as well. So there's been a number of positive announcements that have far exceeded my expectations on the demand side. And I would argue that the demand side of the equation is actually the easier side to model. It's very clear, it's very robust, it's going to continue to be strong. However, when I look at the supply side of the equation, I don't want to say it's been a disaster, but it's been very challenged. Supply is very fragile today. If you want to put some easy numbers around this, on the demand side last year, I would argue that global demand was about 180 to 200 million pounds, if you're including some secondary sources. If you look at primary mine supply for 2023, it was about 135 million pounds. So you're currently operating in a market that's already running at, let's say, a 40, 50 million pound structural deficit. And the market's been operating at a structural deficit for a couple of years. That can only go on for so long, especially against a backdrop of a very, very robust demand outlook. So what we've seen is against this backdrop, is we've seen a number of utilities have to come back to market, have to look to sign new long-term contracts. We've seen the volumes of long-term contracting increase over the course of the last couple of years. And we've also seen more activity in the spot market, whether it's utilities, whether it's financial players such as the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust. And when you've had these entrants go into the market, there's a real recognition of how tight the market is and how challenged the market will potentially be on the supply side going forward. So against that backdrop, we have seen a rise in pricing. And I do think that the rise in pricing is constructive and something that is necessary for the market to get the supply response to be able to meet this backdrop of strong demand. And I don't want to be too long-winded, but there's been a number of other factors that I think some of my other panelists could touch on with respect to potential ban of Russian imports of uranium into the United States, transportation issues, and it's just various potential shocks on the supply side that have driven prices higher and could potentially continue to drive prices higher.
Thanks a lot, Katie. I'm going to move things around a little bit because I'm mindful, Sean, you've got a time stop at some point. And I think it goes directly from what Katie just said. Do you want to speak to what some of the initiatives that are underway in the uranium mining project space at this stage?
I can certainly speak to Cameco's initiatives in particular. Yeah. I just add one comment to Katie's very good comments. when you're looking at the market, the spot market's important. The important market to look at is the long-term market. Look at that long-term price indicator. That's what's going to tell you what's going to happen down the road in our industry. And that's the one that we're particularly excited about at Cameco. So at Cameco, we're obviously very excited about what's transpired over the last few years. We're looking to try and address some of the structural deficits that Katie mentioned. We've got a strong exploration portfolio. We pulled in our horns a number of years ago to focus on the Athabasca Sandstone region in northern Saskatchewan. We have very extensive land holdings up there, upwards of 35, 39 joint ventures, exploration joint ventures. If you care to peruse our MD&A, we've had some very good results in our exploration portfolio. That's looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and that's the sort of length of perspective you need on primary uranium supply. In terms of what we're doing closer in, Cigar Lake, which is one of our flagship operations, we're targeting 18 million pounds this year, and we've launched the project to extend the life of that mine out to 2036. We're looking at the McArthur River Key Lake complex, getting back up to 18 million pounds this year. And starting the evaluation to look at taking annual production at that site up to 25 million pounds. That's an operation that will run into the 2040s at current rate. Moving down the processing road a little bit, Port Hope, which just a few years ago was down to 1,000 tons of production a year, UF6 conversion. We're targeting 12,500 tons this year. And then, of course, it's also a UO2 facility. We have our fabrication facilities which service OPG and Bruce Power running, I'm not sure I can say at capacity, but at a very high level. And then we're continuing to be interested in the enrichment space. We have a 49% interest, movable up to 75% in an outfit called Global Laser Enrichment, which is looking at developing an enrichment technology, currently headquartered south of the border. That's where our facilities are. It's being done in conjunction with an Australian company called Silex. Give you an example of the timelines required for this industry and my own time in it. We first got involved in Silex in 2008. It went into hiatus because of the bad market in 2013-14, and really just revived in 2018. And we're now working very assiduously to try and bring it along the technology development path. And then finally, moving back to fabrication, along with Brookfield, we completed the acquisition of Westinghouse last year, which has lots of facets to it, but particularly interested to the current fleet. They provide a large portion of the fuel for the light water reactor market in the US and Europe and elsewhere. So we're pretty active right across the space, I think, Ian.
Yeah. No, we on here? Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thanks, Sean. And we designed this panel a little bit to be able to present both the supply side of things and also the operating side of things. And because I think it's important to get some perspective here. So, Sean, thanks for sort of give us a sense of where Cameco's at with regards to the world today. I want to turn to both James and Brenda. James, maybe you can start, but what has changed from your perspective in recent years in Canada and beyond, and given rise to this renewed interest in nuclear power? And what have been the main drivers in growth from your perspective in the nuclear energy as a solution to address climate change? One of you can sort of touch on that as a person who's actively involved at Bruce Power.
Yeah, Ian, happy to. So, from my perspective, I think there's really three elements that have come together here. Maybe I'll start with Canada. I think the fact, and certainly OPG can speak to their life extension program, but from a Canadian perspective, between Bruce Power's refurbishment program and Darlington's, it really represents the largest, one of the largest two infrastructure programs in Canada. And between both of those programs, you're seeing very, what I would say, a successful execution of those programs from a cost and schedule perspective. Bruce Power returned our Unit 6 refurbishment to service under budget and well ahead of schedule, and I know Darlington has had similar success. So number one, from a Canadian and Ontario perspective, the predictability of the life of these large capital projects, we've really demonstrated, we've learned from lessons in the past around that. And I think that's provided some stronger confidence on the part of the government and certainly investors. From a macro perspective, for some time, nuclear has been making progress in the net zero space, and a real recognition of the importance of nuclear from a net zero perspective. We've seen countries like Germany, for example, who have reduced their reliance on nuclear power, really struggle with reducing emissions. In fact, having gone in the opposite direction. So you sort of have this foundation of net zero and a drive to net zero. And then I really think the war in Ukraine put an increased focus on energy security. So you really have this very unique convergence of concern around energy security and a significant push to net zero. And I think the combination of those two factors have really sort of hyper focused the need for nuclear, and really what it comes down to is just if you're concerned about net zero and you're concerned about energy security, there's really not a lot of tools in the toolbox, and you very quickly focus on nuclear. What I would also say, and in particular to my friend Sean at Cameco, Cameco is really one of the great Canadian companies. And I think what we have that's very unique here in Canada is we have a full life cycle here, from mining of uranium in northern Saskatchewan to processing to nuclear power operations to the supply chain to a respected international regulator. So I really believe Canada has been ahead of the world on this. And as the rest of the world is moving to nuclear power and looking at it, I think many people are looking at Canada as a really important example, and frankly a bright spot that is many years ahead of other jurisdictions.
Wow, thank you. Brenda, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just a couple of very short points. So in addition to having the Ontario government as very supportive of nuclear, and I agree very much with James that that's been tied to the successful execution of both the Bruce Power and OPG refurbishments. I think that's also paved the way for their support of our Darlington new nuclear project, where we are looking to deploy the BWX 300. Well, we are deploying the BWX 300 at Darlington to be followed by 3 additional units. So having that provincial support, and actually provincial support across the country in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and New Brunswick have been very helpful. And also the Canadian government has been tremendously supportive of nuclear with the introduction of the ITC, with the establishment of the Project Pre-Development Fund to support the deployment of new nuclear in Canada. And then finally, Canada's support with other countries, as evidenced at COP, where Canada was one of 22 countries that pledged to commit the tripling of nuclear by 2050.
Wow. Yeah, and I guess, you didn't mention it expressly, but I guess organizations like the Canada Infrastructure Bank as well, providing financial support to structure some of the funding of some of the projects too, has played a role as well.
Yes, and applicable to Darlington New Nuclear.
Yeah. Paul, yeah, go ahead, John. Yeah.
I had just to add one comment on top of Brenda and James's comments. There's a third driver that I don't think we should forget about easier, and that's just that there's a need for continued electrification in the world. There's large chunks of the world that are underserved. And if you look across the more developed world, I think a lot of the developments that are exciting people now are pushing up electricity requirements, AI in particular. I don't have those stats right at my fingertips, but we're looking at an increased need for electricity,
Sure.
coupled with the energy security concerns and the decarbonization. So there's three tailwinds there that I would point to.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks, Sean. Paul, can we get your perspective from as someone who's outside of Canada? We've been talking a lot about how things are kind of rosy in respect of Canadian aspects of this, but I think you bring an interesting perspective as to what's changed beyond our borders to drive the market. Do you want to sort of delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the prior speakers have hit on all of the elements a bit. I think it's good to just kind of reinforce. You've got, I think almost it's three legs of a stool. It's, as was mentioned, energy security, net zero. And then I think there's the geopolitical side. I think speaking from, the US perspective, one of the big things in terms of nuclear exports is it's not so much about supporting US companies as it is about countering Russia and China. And of course, the secondary benefit is our companies benefit. And, you think about friends and allies. So, for example, the United States had never signed an intergovernmental agreement to do a nuclear project. We like to sign MOUs, which are the I love you, you love me, let's do nuclear together. But the US-Poland IGA that was signed a few years ago was significant because it was really to do a project together, albeit, our companies are not government owned, so you still need things to happen at a corporate level. But then, within a year's time, there was also an intergovernmental agreement for Romania. And that was interesting at several levels because first it was about kicking the Chinese out. And then it was about, in theory, the U.S. coming in. But the reality is that Chernobyl units 1, 3, and 4, which are the subject of, refurbishment and completion, are CANDU reactors. And so it really represented sort of a U.S. and friends type approach, which is reflective of the nuclear sector where, these projects are going to be done multilaterally, maybe not just by one country specifically because of the nature of the supply chain. But I think this geopolitical element, which obviously impacts a lot of the things we're going to talk about today, is relevant to, when you think about OECD countries and ambitions for nuclear and how to view the nuclear marketplace, thinking about it in terms of the need to counter Russia and China, and that means bringing financing and all those things. But the one last thing not to be too long-winded, but I think, it was just mentioned the 3X pledge by 2050. I mean, that's not going to happen, but it's hugely important that it was said. There's no way we're going to be able to build it that quickly. But the fact that people are saying it is really important. And I think the other thing that's really important, it's a powerful signal from Canada, was, both OPG and Bruce Power did bond issuances within the last few years, multi-$100 million bond issuances that were oversubscribed by 6X, that were rated by Cicero in the middle level in terms of green bonds. And I think that, even though they weren't used purposely for building new units, the fact that you had green bond issuances for nuclear that were oversubscribed to the way they were is hugely impactful, as was, at the federal level. Initially, nuclear wasn't going to be in the Canadian, federal bond program, and that's since changed. So I think you're seeing these developments out of Canada, out of the United States. We can talk about some other places as well, just putting nuclear in a different space to include that 3X pledge that's very significant, albeit a bit unrealistic.
There's a lot there. Thank you, Paul. Can we bring it? So I want to turn to Brenda. Brenda, this is something you've been involved with directly recently. How can existing nuclear power plant operators ensure a safe, reliable supply of uranium fuel from sources that are not subject to sanctions? Can you sort of delve into that? Because I think you're actively, that's your role at OPG at the present time.
Yes, happy to do so. So it's critical that we as operators are really partnering with our suppliers in order to secure the enriched fuels that we need to support our technologies. It's very important that we start that procurement as early as possible.
And in fact, what we recognized very early on was that we had to start our planning for our enriched fuels much sooner than we did for our can-do fuels. And we really did listen to our suppliers on that note. And in December at the World Nuclear Exhibition in Paris, we were very pleased to announce that we had secured all of our initial and inventory loads for our first SMR at Darlington, putting arrangements in place with Cameco, Urenco, Orano, and GE Nuclear Fuels as our fuel fabricator. We were really pleased with that announcement because it demonstrated that we were able to secure enriched fuels by partnering with suppliers in like-minded countries. And it also demonstrated the importance of having diversity in your supplier base. And I think it's incredibly important that we as operators continue to work very closely with our suppliers, with the industry in general, and also with government in order excuse me, in order to ensure that we can secure the enriched fuel supplies that we need, not only to support Canada, but to support all of our allied partners.
Thank you. Thank you. And so for context, for those who aren't aware, so all of the CANDU fuel at the present time, it's natural uranium. It's not enriched. And so it's now a unique development in Canada that you're dealing with. You're going to need to use enriched fuel for your new fleet of SMRs.
Yes, correct. While enriched uranium has been used in Canada for some of the research reactors,
Yep.
This is the first time that operators for on-grid electricity need to ensure that we've got enriched fuels to support our technology.
Thank you. Thank you. Alex, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Do you want to provide some context from the standpoint of in the fuel supply space, both in Canada and the U.S. and elsewhere? What's your thought on some of these developments?
Sure, happy to do that. Washington politically is becoming a very busy space in terms of policy and what it will ultimately mean for the future of nuclear energy. Much of that has to do with items that Paul had mentioned already, and that is countering the activity of traditionally active players in the nuclear energy space, that is Russia and China. A couple of things happened. I like to say sometimes that my job is to bring folks down to realistic expectations. Now that we talked about all of the optimistic wave of good news that kind of washed over the industry over the past couple of years, all of that positivity is resting on the finite capabilities of getting uranium extracted out of the ground, and more importantly, the jurisdictions where we do the mining. And that takes us directly to the situation that the United States, Canada, the allied nations find themselves in, trying to ensure that the supply of raw material is uninterrupted, guaranteed, and risk-free. And that is where the conversation is taking place in Washington, D.C. We talked about it before the panel about the looming instruments that the U.S. government is putting together to enforce Russian ban on uranium. For simplicity's sake, it's called Russian uranium ban, but in fact, it touches more on Russian enrichment component of the business, since Russia traditionally did not provide much of the natural uranium component to the market. But we're finding ourselves in a very challenging predicament right now, and that is professionally trying to understand how far out we can stretch the tolerance level for, most importantly, the end users in Canada, the United States, and the partnering countries, and also what instruments we have in place to ensure that that supply of material that we have with partnerships that are located in sensitive jurisdictions is still existing and uninterrupted.
And is it fair to say that some of the things that Brenda's talked about getting the supply chain support from different jurisdictions? I mean, it'll be the first on-grid SMR in a Western country.
Yes, that's correct.
And so, you're, this is a sort of a test case in some respects just to make this happen. And so those kinds of examples have to be successful. In other words, you need to get friendly nations to be able to provide those supports and organizations like Cameco to play a role in the supply chain. But then we need to build up the supply chain components. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. I think what we're seeing across the board, and this is not specifically touching on uranium or nuclear space, more globally, I think folks are toning down the appetites of how far you can stretch your supply chains in general. And the general sense is that folks are trying to bring their supply chains closer to home and do a lot of insourcing and applying instruments that are at their disposal or at the disposal of their governments to make sure that you no longer have to move your ore across two oceans, right? And that you're not dealing with highly sensitive jurisdictions that are standing in between, like the Red Sea right now, and things that we're seeing up through the northern route, through the ports of St. Petersburg that involve Russian vessels and Russian material.
Sure.
Yeah, if you don't mind me layering in as well, just on the supply side, exactly to Alex's point, is a lot of the global supply right now is concentrated in various jurisdictions. Canada has always been a reliable supplier of uranium, in particular through Cameco with their McArthur River and Cigar Lake operations. So it was very encouraging to see Cameco restart McArthur River, Key Lake. And I would say in North America, we are starting to see some positive developments on the supply side. So we have seen a number of U.S. in situ recovery mines announce that they're going to restart, and hopefully we'll see some of that production this year and an increase into future years. And that has been driven by success in long-term contracting, which Sean mentioned earlier. So that's encouraging for the market. And we're also starting to see some advancements on some of these larger development stage assets in Canada. I would point to NextGen's Arrow project. It has its provincial approval. It's still waiting for its final federal and CNSC approval, but it's encouraging to see that we're now at a point in the market where we could potentially see new large-scale uranium projects actually getting full federal provincial approval and getting constructed. And I do think against a backdrop of strong demand, we're going to need new supply to come online.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense. Sean, any reflection upon what Alex has said a little bit? Because I know you, although we talk about Cameco as being a Canadian company, you guys are really international in this space.
Just a couple of things. One, I'll just add to Katie's answer. Don't forget Australia when you're looking at stable jurisdictions that are viewed as historically stable. They are blessed with a tremendous uranium endowment too, and BHP's Olympic Dam operation has got a long history in front of it, and so that's another good source of supply that's out there that we don't underestimate. Looking broader, we of course have been active in Kazakhstan for over 20 years now. I think maybe one of my first trips with Cameco was to Kazakhstan. We've been producing uranium in conjunction with Kazatomprom at JV since 2009. There are issues over there right now associated with the dislocation caused by the Ukraine war. Acid is in tight supply, but that seems to be stabilizing again. Transportation is more complex than it used to be, but we now take all our deliveries through the Trans-Caspian route, and it's worked for us for 2 years now. So things are more difficult, but they've got a tremendous uranium endowment, and we're happy to continue working with them. And I think most utilities out there do a pretty good job of analyzing their risk, and none of them, I believe, have all their eggs in one basket. So yeah, there's risk, but I don't think you want to move away from some of those jurisdictions like Kazakhstan either. So that's what I would add to that.
I 100% agree. Perhaps one last thing, Sean, to your point. I think what is extremely helpful is to have Canada as an agent with direct access to the information of how things develop in the alternative delivery routes, to communicate to not just traditional customers of theirs, but to a global community of potential customers. And so having a couple of eyes, not just the national operator, but also a supplier and a producer like Cameco, co-discovering this alternative route is equally important.
Thank you. Any other comments from other panelists? Maybe we can turn to new reactor design. There's been a lot of talk in the SMR space, and maybe this accentuates the challenge. And maybe Paul, I can go to you first in this one. A lot of the new reactor design depends upon more enriched fuel. People refer to it as HALEU fuel, or and in some respects, it accentuates some of the challenges in the supply chain space. Because we need additional services and it's new and unique. What are people doing at early stages in planning for that kind of stuff, and what should people in Canada understand, given the fact that we don't do enrichment here? Do you want to speak to that, Paul?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. I think the short answer is it's difficult right now because, when you look at HALEU specifically, distinguishing for those in the audience, you hear the term SMRs and then you'll hear the term advanced reactors. And so when you get into the advanced reactor space, you're dealing with sort of advanced fuel types and the need for high assay, low enriched uranium, which is not really available in the market other than from Russia. So if you go back a few years, the strategy of the reactor vendors that were coming into the space were saying, well, we'll start to buy from Russia, but then we want to look to North American supply or, the French. And that was kind of the view. And then really right around the time of the Ukraine war, it was clear that that was not going to be acceptable. And so, everybody came out and said, okay, well, we're not doing that. And I think what it comes down to, and I think this is actually relevant beyond HALEU, is you're seeing it as a national security issue. And you're seeing, if you think of electricity as critical infrastructure, and if you think of the need for baseload energy for large industrial societies, if you want it to be clean, you need nuclear. The fuel side of it starts to be a bit of a national security issue. And that's even more so in the HALEU sense. And I think the difficulty right now is how do you scale it? Because right now there are no advanced reactor projects in construction, that have a construction license that are actually, at the site constructing based on an approved license from the regulatory authority. And so there's a question about, well, when are these projects going to hit the market? And then, going from flat to sort of almost vertical, if you believe the vendors, how do you scale this? And, one of the things, and I'll stop here because I know others will want to say stuff on this too, but, a couple of years ago, I heard Dan Poneman, who was the former CEO at Centrus, speaking in an event. And he said, when I look at my customer base now, it's all utilities with big balance sheets, and I feel very comfortable selling to them because they're known commodities. But now I have advanced reactor developers coming to me. They're not well capitalized. I don't know when their projects are going to happen. How do I take that risk? When you look at the nuclear renaissance from the 2000s, you had, Japan Steelworks, you had Sheffield Forgemasters scale up, not on the fuel supply, but in the fabrication side, and then lost tons of money because the renaissance didn't happen. And so there's that bit of a chicken and the egg in all of this. And why I mentioned national security is because I think that, at least for the United States, the U.S. government will step in and do something. It may not be the most elegant solution, it may not be the most efficient solution, but what they will do is they will step in and solve this. Will they get the timing exactly right? I don't know. But I think that you will see a government-driven solution, at least to sort of get the market going. And then it really becomes a question of, who are you have to look at the projects. And if you have well-capitalized utilities that are ending up being the buyers of the HALEU, that starts to change the dynamic. But I think that sort of who am I providing that order? When do they need it? How do I predict that? The big investments that need to be made. And I think that's where you're going to need to see government support to get it going.
I saw James nodding there for part of that. I know you're not looking to buy any HALEU fuel today, but you're obviously a well-capitalized utility, and imagine you're dealing with some of these issues. You want to reflect upon what Paul just said?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to the discussion is I think one of the areas we're going to really be able to get a clearer picture on over the next several years is what new reactor designs are real. Bruce Power, we're undertaking an RFI process right now where, as we're doing pre-development work on our site, we're trying to not get locked into a technology decision too early. And what I would say is that over the next few years, we're going to know what reactors are real and what reactors are PowerPoint reactors. And oftentimes we talk about a lot of these reactors as if they're real, and some of them are. Some of them may get there, some of them may not. And what's really important for the industry is to be very clear that before we progress with anything, one of the key elements of our success with our life extension program has been that we had all design work complete. The design was locked. We were able to advance with procurement. We were able to advance with planning and preparation. And those principles of large capital project execution remain the same for new nuclear. So, one of the things, we were all at the Canadian Nuclear Association conference last week. One of the things I continued to reinforce with everybody is we want to see a complete design. Whether that's, and I won't get into listing them all out, but people have a few years here to sharpen their pencils and show us that they have a design, because what we're not going to do is we're not going to repeat the mistakes from the past and do design on the fly. As a utility, we expect the design done so we can properly estimate and prepare a project. And I think that discipline is important, and it's pretty important that we suss out pretty quickly what reactors are real and what ones are a pipe dream, so to speak. And that's going to be very important for the industry.
Well, that's very good. That's very interesting context, and frankly good advice for anybody doing a project. Lots of planning before you actually start moving into actual execution. Brenda, you're partway through. You've gone through the life extension processes, or you're obviously advancing, and those have been very successful. But you're also now involved in building the first grid scale SMR. Any reflections upon what James has just said, and how it applies to some of the fuel supply considerations we've got at play?
Yes, no, I agree with what James has said. I think important lessons learned from the nuclear industry is the need to have a complete design prior to deployment. That is, what we had in place for Darlington refurbishment, and that is certainly what we are doing for Darlington New Nuclear. We are working very closely with GH, the technology developer, on that front. We are also part of the technology collaboration agreement with GE Hitachi, TVA, and Synthos, where we are collectively working on the design development for the BWX 300. And then we are similarly working very closely with our other vendor partners through an integrated project delivery model at Darlington for the design and deployment of the technology. So very much looking to have certainty prior to execution. And of course, as we move forward and we are looking at all these other reactor technologies, having that level of certainty in place will be key. And I think we all need to work together collectively as we move forward. And we and technology developers are going to need to know when is the appropriate time to signal to the fuel fabrication or fuel enrichers converters and fabricators when we will deploy a new technology that could possibly require HALEU.
Okay. And I'm assuming that they're part of all that discussion in respect of the design stage and what the supply chain what supplies may be needed over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, and what the specifications are and where it's going to come from, whether it's going to come from Australia or Canada or Kazakhstan. I guess that those are all elements that play into your decisions.
Yeah, it's absolutely key. And with the BWX 300, it's a very advanced design. The third generation of that boiling water reactor technology is very well known, and it's pretty straightforward from a fuel fabrication perspective. So really, we weren't taking on a lot of risk with the selection of that technology, and particularly when it comes to the supply of fuel. But certainly, as we move forward as an industry and we are looking at other technologies that are more complicated, that are more novel, we are going to need to ensure that we are involving all members of the supply chain as early as possible.
Yep. Yeah, and presumably government organizations and national security becomes an issue.
And regulators, and yes,
Absolutely,
a very wide group of stakeholders will need to be engaged.
Yep. No, and we haven't got to regulators yet. We can talk about that in a little bit. So I want to get back to something, Katie, I committed we kind of would get to, and maybe it's a good time to bring it up. Because we've now kind of got a sense of some of the interesting issues that are at play. What are if you're you engage with them, I imagine, on a regular basis, probably daily. What are investors excited about, or what are some of the challenges investors are thinking about? And I'm thinking about investors from the standpoint of people looking to invest into new mining projects or capital raisings, because we've seen some pretty material capital raisings in the uranium space. Do you want to give some context as to how they sort of see the world now?
Yeah, definitely. I would say investor sentiment has changed dramatically. When I first started covering the space, the uranium spot price was $25 a pound. The term price was maybe $30 a pound. I was going around pitching numerous investors globally on the sector saying, it's got to turn, pricing has to turn. We're at a point where pricing is not sustainable to incentivize new supply. And investors basically laughed me out of the room when I said uranium is going to be $60 by 2025. Okay, well, now we're in 2024 and uranium's $95 a pound, so I think I was correct on that one. But needless to say, is investor interest is very high right now. They can see what's happened in terms of government policy, in terms of public perception. They are doing work on fundamentals. They're understanding the current demand and supply balance, and they do have a belief that pricing is sustainable. And I think that's actually very important, because for the first time, what we've seen in particular over the last 12 and 24 months is capital flow back into the sector. And I think we do need capital flowing back into the sector to make sure that, at least on my side, in terms of the upstream supply, is that we're getting yellowcake out of the ground and we're getting it to end users in a timely manner. So we've been heavily involved in a number of capital raises over the last 12 to 24 months. And I think that's been important, that investors have been supportive of that. And that's resulted in, some of the U.S. projects being able to have the capital to actually refund their restarts and get into production. So investor interest is high. I hope it stays high. I think we're going to need it in the sector.
Well, and I guess it's, and that's principally on the mining side of things. And Paul touched upon, green bonds, and that was mostly on the project side of things, and I know, Bruce Power and OPG have also raised some capital, significant amounts. I mean, is investor sentiment? Is it fair to say that investor sentiment for uranium mining is consistent with investor sentiment for nuclear power generally, or is it? Is there a significant difference between the two?
No, I think so. I think what has driven the sentiment and has sustained the sentiment is the fact that investors understand nuclear power. They view it as a necessary part of the energy mix going forward. So they're feeling more optimistic in terms of being able to feel confident giving capital towards potential projects.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the pervasive message is that we're going to need more power. And we're going to need it yesterday. And for that reason, I think that the quickest deployable solution that is reliable, green, and responsible is nuclear. So a lot of folks who are incidentally finding themselves in the nuclear space are there because they're pursuing other appetites, right? But incidentally, that places them in this is the region of technology, because that's the quickest deployable, frankly, and the most reliable and less expensive solution there.
And maybe one point is it's global. Like, I've been marketing through Australia recently, London, New York, Boston, Canada, even Brazil. And the investor reach is broad, and it's not just resource-specific funds that are looking at the sector anymore. It's large institutions, generalist fund, ESG-focused funds. So I think it's really interesting to see the broad-based interest as well.
Ian, I might, just a couple of observations that Katie and Alex's. We were out in the market last year. Embarrassingly, I can't remember how much money we raised, but we did an equity raise in conjunction with the Westinghouse acquisition that was very successful. It's put us into a new sphere. We don't have a lot of peers. I don't think we have any real peers. We're trying to figure out exactly where we go. Grant, Isaac, and company are working on that all the time. But there is an appetite out there. I think we found it there. And then I would point outside of the public capital markets. You've got savvy investors like Brookfield Asset Management willing to put significant money into the sphere. That tells me something too. So I think there is an appetite out there in the capital markets and just in the investment community generally.
And don't forget the market segments that appeared just very recently, and that is big data and artificial intelligence that is very power thirsty. And I think you will, over time, see a lot of that SMR energy channeled into completely designated units, channeling and generating electricity to power those initiatives.
And I guess that's hard to predict as to what those might be. But I do recognize that at least in Ontario, our IESO has said that we need to double or triple the size of the grid to support just the electrification of elements of our economy that are currently carbon emitting. And so, it just seems to be that there's going to be lots of opportunities to fill that void with the likes of power from Bruce and from OPG and what that looks like going forward. And that's just in Ontario. Interesting. Okay, I want to touch a bit on, and I want to put a damper on things, but I'm a lawyer, and we tend to focus on regulatory on occasion. And regulation I think regulation is important in this sector for a number of different elements. And Brenda, I want to go to you on this one. What developments do you think do we need to see in the near term and the longer term from a regulatory perspective, both domestically and internationally? Because I think there's a lot of collaboration between the CNSC and other parties. And what are you seeing on the ground as an operator and someone who interacts with CNSC and others on a daily basis? What are you hoping to see over the next 18 months to 3 years?
Well, I'd say that right now we have the regulatory framework in place to support our needs for fuel for the BWX 300. So both transportation and storage. And we are working with the NWMO on storage for spent fuel. However, as we look at other technologies that will require more enriched fuel like HALEU, I think there's going to have to be greater regulatory involvement and regulatory collaboration, particularly amongst nuclear safety regulators, will be very important. And I think the CNSC has been great in terms of collaborating with other nuclear safety regulators. The CNSC has an MOU in place with the NRC in the US, as well as the PA in Poland. to ensure that the right regulatory framework is set up for the deployment of the BWRX 300, to ensure that all regulators are establishing best practices. So I think that that really is a great roadmap for how we need to tackle more complex regulatory issues when it comes to enriched uranium, particularly when we're looking at HALEU.
Who's driving the bus there? Is that sort of a collaboration amongst the utilities who are going to then put that fuel to work? Is it the international kind of elements that are at play as for that are focused on fuel security? Is it a mix?
It's a mix. Yeah, it's the utilities working very closely with the regulator and governments. And you can't create that level of international collaboration without getting government involvement. So having industry, including the regulators and government involved, will be key going forward.
Okay. James, do you want to reflect upon that a little bit? Because I think, obviously you're, that's something you're dealing with on a regular basis, and at Bruce.
Yeah, so I think the only other item I would add from a regulatory perspective that I think is really important is I think Canada is at a very important crossroads here as they review the impact assessment. Coming out of the federal budget here, I'm really hoping, and I think the whole industry is, that we have some clarity on that legislation. At the end of the day, for many years we've been talking about a lot of the regulatory challenges with getting new projects up and running. The truth is, if you look at the time frame it takes to construct a new facility, whether it's a mine facility, a processing facility, a nuclear power plant, the impact assessment should be, what I always say, should be the easy part of the process. And so, I think the eyes are all going to be watching Canada coming out of the federal budget here on what happens with the impact assessment, and most importantly, how expeditiously is it advanced. At the end of the day, a lot of these decisions that we're talking about, they really should supersede individual micro interests, and really look at the national interest in Canada and strategically where do we need to be. So I think we've had some really strong signals out of Ottawa that we can all be optimistic about, but the proof will be in the pudding with the budget and the associated actions following up. We have to really get moving very quickly, and we can't have processes that take years and years and years. We have a life cycle regulator in the case of the CNSC, and we should be using that regulator effectively.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And as you're saying that, I'm reflecting upon some of the other mining projects that are out there, and they're focused on some of the similar kind of challenges. And so we all recognize the overall need of certain focuses of regulation, but at the same time, they can't be used as, or they shouldn't be used as barriers to address certain special interests.
If I might just add one last thing, government can also work not only as a chief regulator, but also an encourager of sorts. I'm thinking Australia, with enormous amount of potential for mining going forward. What the country seems to be stumbling upon is the irregular political agenda when it comes to nuclear policies and uranium extraction, and to that sense, a clear signal from the Australian government endorsing and throwing the support behind mining initiatives would go a very long way in bolstering those supply chains that we talked about.
You met. Can we dig into that a little more detail? Like you're a little bit vague on, no disrespect, but you're a little bit vague on that. Like so Australia doesn't have nuclear power at the present time, but they've got great resources from the standpoint of uranium and obviously a skilled workforce and so on. Like you're saying, like, do you want to delve into a little more detail there?
Sure. I think some of the uncertainties are brought in by the election cycles, and that largely has to do with exactly what you said, Ian, and that is the lack of buy-in. Canada is in an incredibly privileged position where that complete cycle of nuclear activities gives you a full perspective as a stakeholder to understand where the material ultimately go and what the implications are. Australia is just a one piece, and that is natural uranium component without the nuclear power. So the clearer the message communicated by the Australian government, encouraging the full understanding of their potential role in the global market, I think the more chances we have in the growth in uranium mining sector in the country.
Okay. And can we bring it a little closer to home? So if we think about the U.S., we had a lot of supply chain capabilities mothballed to some degree over the last little while. We've got a lot of nuclear power plants either shut down or talking about shutting down. Now we're talking about kind of restarting some of them. What are you encouraged about what's going on in the U.S.? Are there challenges, and what's going to quell your enthusiasm in the U.S. in that respect? Because obviously it's an election year, and there's obviously special interests. There's very smart, engaged environmental lobbies in the U.S. that are not pro-nuclear. What's your sense of things?
Yeah, I think you touched on the election year. I think that's exactly where we are. So there's some sort of a hiatus that has been put on the activity in that space. But going for a moment beyond 2024, I think the issue is, Paul had mentioned it with respect to SMR, but I think equally important is understanding that the largely exhausted elephant field production out of the United States. We had a very robust, obviously defense-related program, and then civilian mining operations beginning in the 1950s that had depleted a lot of really promising fields a long time ago. So the remnants and the up-and-coming projects that we're hearing about right now, the question is the scalability.
Yep.
and how capable they are in existing, number one, in the current reality price brackets, because spot price being only a component of it, what you really are looking for is a long-term price trends that determine the guarantee that the prices are here to stay, and they're here to sustain the long-term development solution.
Yep.
And certainty for the investors, of course. So scalability, I would say, is the key question right now for U.S. miners, and how they structure their dialogue with the regulator and the investors.
Gotcha.
Just adding on to that as well. I speak with a number of the U.S. soon-to-be producers, and one thing they're really struggling with is labor. One of the issues is a lot of these projects shut down. A lot of the skilled labor disappeared. A lot of people don't necessarily want to live in some of the areas where these uranium mines are. So it has been a challenge, and they've struggled to get people, and the people have come in a lot more expensive than what they were previously expecting. So I think it speaks to your comments on what is the appropriate long-term price to incentivize and be able to scale production domestically in the U.S.
Go ahead, Sean. Yeah.
I just go back. We have some experience in Australia, and I think, Alex, you characterized it right. It's a political issue. It's not a regulatory issue. We have deposits in West Australia that I think will be a long time being developed, because the West Australian government is currently very anti-nuclear or anti-uranium mining. Other jurisdictions are different. In Australia, they're federally organized, just like us, and the states have significant power over natural resources.
Okay, I'm mindful of time. It's about 10 after 9 at the present time, and we committed to end this at 9:15. I've got one more question for the audience, for the panelists here, but if there's a question out of the audience, I'm happy to take it. Sir, and we got a microphone for you there.
Thank you. The question comes to pricing on uranium, and we've heard that the price has doubled over the last 12 months from 40 to 90. 90 is obviously good news for Sean, but bad news for Brenda. When you're planning a reactor, it's a big project. What's the I suppose the tipping point on a price for your feedstock? Have you got flesh above 90? At what point does a reactor become economical for anyone here?
Well, I think when we look at uranium, I mean, the price is going to fluctuate, and when we look at deploying any project, we look at all of the costs over the life of that project, the levelized cost of energy, and at the end of the day, we just need to make sure that we end up with a LUIC that makes sense, and that will include, our forecasts of what we think fuel is going to cost.
Yeah.
And just to add from a Bruce Power perspective, without sort of sharing anything commercially sensitive, on the existing fleet, your front end fuel cost would be less than 5% of your per megawatt hour cost. So right now we're paid $95 a megawatt hour for our electricity here at Bruce Power. Less than 5% of that would be the front end fuel cost. So even though we're always squeezing Sean for better pricing, it is not a significant factor in terms of the variability of economics for nuclear.
I was just going to add to that. The posted spot price doesn't mean that we're automatically getting $90 a pound from all of our customers at OPG and Bruce Power. I was also going to make the same point that James did about your all-in fuel costs being a significant but not overwhelming portion of your operating costs. Both OPG and Bruce Power have studies looking a long way out as to what they can bear. I think the figure I keep hearing for the light water reactor fleet is that it's a little closer to 10%. I think that's because of the enrichment component. So, and then in terms, just one other additional comment, the long-term price that I mentioned at the beginning, it typically runs ahead of the spot price. So we're in a very odd period right now. So I think we are seeing some structural changes in the industry to make us catch up to our operating exploration and all-in costs. So there's lots of uranium out there. It's an economic question to bring it to the market.
Thank you. We got one more question here from the audience.
I've heard a lot of talk about the mechanics of supply, fuel, that sort of thing here today, and some discussions about regulations. I was quite encouraged to find out this week that SRC signed an agreement to get a small modular reactor put there. And it raised the question in my mind about the acceptance in not just the federal regulators, but the acceptance and regulation at the smaller municipal and other levels that we're going to be faced as a mining industry or as the industry in general to bring them into communities, at mine sites, wherever. And I'm just wondering what the panelists see that heading towards in terms of discussions, pre-approvals, how we're getting social license for small modular reactors, that sort of thing.
Does anyone want to?
Yeah, could I just answer real quick? I'm going to be the rude American because I got to go. But just really quickly, Cross River, we're working at the Port of Belledune in New Brunswick with, we're going to be using an arc reactor, which is an advanced reactor. There's huge importance in terms of stakeholder engagement at all levels, and that includes, with the First Nations and bringing them along and getting them involved in the project. The same is true in Saskatchewan for what SaskPower is doing. And, I think that's got to start very early. Part of it is just general education that applies to any nuclear project anywhere in the world. But I think the other thing that's really important is when you look at nuclear projects, and the mine, the full ecosystem, you need to do a good economic impact benefit analysis. And so, what I mean by that is at a project level, you do a financial model, and that's going to determine whether the project's viable or not. But in the nuclear space, there's so many benefits that do not come into that model that are very important for the communities, for helping to get government support in terms of financial support for the project. And so you look at, jobs during construction, jobs during operation, energy security, energy diversity, the decarbonization, educational benefits in terms of training programs and university programs, and taxes, all these things that the project developer doesn't benefit from, the owner doesn't benefit from inside the financial model. But also, after 30 years, everything's going to discount to zero. Yet, for large reactors, a Westinghouse reactor, an AP1000, it's going to get licensed for 60 years, which means it'll probably run for 100. So, helping people to understand not only the safety, security, and safeguards issues and other things about the technology, but the project benefits, the unique things about nuclear, and doing that early in the process, I think is really important. And then having that be an ongoing commitment throughout the life of the project, having information centers, having, being transparent, thinking about reputational issues, overall project structuring, whether it's a mine or the reactor itself. I mean, all those things are very important to do it early and to be committed to it and to do it throughout the life of the project. So, listen, I have to go, but I just want to say thank you to everybody. I'm sorry I have to run, but it was a great session. And Ian and Fasken, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Appreciate it.
I can just add to what Paul has said. With respect to the deployment of our SMR technology at Darlington, we have been engaging with the Indigenous communities for years now, as well as the community of Clarington. And Paul touched on some really key points. It's so important to educate stakeholders and Indigenous communities on the importance of nuclear, the benefits of nuclear, the economic impacts that a project of this nature will deliver, both to the Indigenous community as well as to stakeholders. And in fact, in Durham, we have set up the Canadian Centre for Nuclear Sustainability, to educate communities and stakeholders on the benefits of nuclear from beginning to end.
Yeah, well, I commend you guys on that, and I think the sector in Canada, I'm a big fan, but I think the sector in Canada has done a really good job about that. James, I don't know if you've got some reflections upon that, and you guys have been very much engaged in Kincardine and up the Bruce Peninsula there as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you can't regulate this kind of area. Fundamentally, it's about the proponents working as hard as they can every single day to continue to earn that public confidence. And I think you've got a lot of companies in the nuclear industry that work to do that. And it's not just one point in time and pre-development. It's really an ongoing effort. And what I would say is, if you look at most communities in Canada that have nuclear facilities, whether they're mines or reactors, every one of those communities is begging for more. They want to see more, and that tells you something about the social acceptance. So obviously more work to do, but I think the proof is really speaks for itself.
Well, thank you. Unless we've got some other pressing questions from the audience, I'm going to cut it off at that. We're past 9:15. We're now 9:20. So thank you very much for staying late. It's been a great discussion. Thank you for all the insights that have been shared from all the panelists and the questions from the audience. Thank you. This is an intriguing area. I've been actively involved in the nuclear space for more than a couple of decades. It certainly feels the sun is shining upon us right now, and I hope that continues. I think there's some really interesting opportunities in the future. So Brenda, Katie, Sean, Alex, James, thank you very much for spending time with us this morning and sharing your insightful comments and thoughts. And we look forward to having a further discussion in the future. So thank you again for joining us.